Hey, good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming out. We're going to get started. Yeah, really excited to be part of this event with the Texas Tropical Network, Rhett Butler, and the School of Journalism here at UT. So just want to introduce myself. My name is Keaton Peters. I'm a master's student at the journalism school here. I've mostly done reporting on energy and the environment. And I want to see some show of hands of who's here. Who's a UT student? Yeah. Who's any faculty or staff in the building? Awesome. Anyone just hear about this event from a friend and decide to check it out? Yeah, a couple hands. Awesome. Good to see some familiar faces out there, and excited that you all are here to hear from Rhett Butler about Mongabay, environmental journalism, everything that's going on in his world. So I want to just kind of explain a little bit of how I came into this. In 2017, I was part of, a group of people who kind of were inspired by some of the stuff that Mongabay was doing, and we were all very concerned about climate. And I was part of the founding group of a site called branchoutnow.org, where we did independent journalism on climate solutions, just kind of on our own time. And that was part of what got me into journalism, was just doing it on this like volunteer basis on topics we were interested in. And eventually that brought me to UT to kind of take that career path a little more seriously. And it's been a great journey so far. So I'm excited to be part of this. I want to introduce a little bit about the Texas Tropical Network first. And Eric Iverson, who's here, who is the founder of the Texas Tropical Network, started in 2022 with a grant from the UT Green Fund. Eric hails from the SF Bay Area and studied undergrad at Tulane University in New Orleans, and has been involved in tropical ecology conservation work in Peru and Ecuador, and has just been studying here at UT to get a PhD focused on how physiology and genetics of animals are shaped by different climates, hoping to help be able to predict the effects that climate change might be having in tropical environments. So really excited for this event, and I'm going to turn it over now to Eric to tell us a little bit more about the Texas Tropical Network and why we're all here today.
Great. Thank you so much, Keaton. You guys hear from the microphone? Is that working? Okay, great. So, like Keaton said, my name's Eric Iverson. I founded the Texas Tropical Network a little while ago. I'm going to use the other mic, actually. And so we started the Texas Tropical Network with some funding from the UT Green Fund. So I want to thank them very much for the support. And I want to thank also the Brazil Center, Farah Coffee, the School of Journalism and Media, and the UT Biodiversity Center for making events like this possible. So to begin, I want to tell you guys a little bit about the tropics and why they're so important, why we want to bring people together around these tropical issues. So many of us are familiar with the tropics through the lens of ecology and biodiversity. The tropics have long been appreciated for their remarkable species richness and endemism, with almost all groups of organisms being most diverse in the tropics. The tropics also serve as a museum of biodiversity, home to deep branches of the tree of life that have mostly gone extinct elsewhere. For centuries, this region has been extremely influential to the development of biological theory, from Charles Darwin to Jane Goodall, though local people have rarely benefited from the knowledge produced in the tropics. Now, tropical ecosystems themselves are extremely diverse, ranging from rainforests to coral reefs, from savannas to seagrass and mangroves, and including a variety of other habitats such as dry forests, deserts, and cloud forests, and high-altitude grasslands. And for thousands of years, people have also been at the center of these ecosystems, making their livelihoods from them, modifying them to suit their needs, developing sustainable livelihoods through trial and error, and passing that knowledge on to their descendants. Now, tropical ecosystems the world over are under increasing threat especially from deforestation and forest degradation, mangrove loss, and other forms of land conversion. Now, that's really bad news for all of us wherever we live, because besides the extremely negative effects on biodiversity, rainforests, mangroves, and seagrass beds store an enormous amount of carbon. And when they're destroyed or disturbed, that carbon is released and fuels global warming. Deforestation rates continue to rise, and the global emissions from the loss of tropical tree cover alone now rival the emissions of the entire United States. Despite the industrialized exploitation of tropical ecosystems, the majority of people living in tropical countries remain extremely poor by Western standards. The tropical countries of the world are almost synonymous with the quote-unquote third world, or the developing world, the nations where many people live on dollars per day. And many diseases of poverty remain to be eradicated, and widespread underdevelopment fuels unsustainable resource exploitation. However, while these countries face undeniable challenges, they also have the opportunity to develop on a different path from the already developed nations, a sustainable path that allows prosperity in tandem with local ecosystems rather than at their expense. The first of many economic connections we need to understand between the global north and the global south, or the temperate and tropical zones, is that the colonial legacy of resource extraction continues via the trade in global commodities. Many tropical economies are extremely dependent on exports of cash crops, timber products, and mineral resources to Western and North Asian nations, with fluctuations in global prices deciding the fates of entire ecosystems. These products embody greenhouse gas emissions, a transfer of carbon responsibility between nations. And just as everyone can easily understand the global consequences of carbon emissions, we need to understand the global responsibility for those emissions, regardless of the geographic location where the carbon was actually emitted. Now, legal goods aren't the only thing moving from the global south to the global north. A massive and growing trade in illegal wildlife connects the US, Europe, and China to the global tropics. This trade, largely to supply the exotic pet industry and as a source of traditional medicine, is devastating some of our most endangered species. The global wildlife trade rivals in size the trades in drugs, guns, and human trafficking, and it's not the only illegal trade with a negative impact on tropical ecosystems. Drug cartels are also having widespread impacts on tropical forests throughout the Americas especially. Now, one of the consequences of our global commodity markets and the emissions they produce is that the whole world is becoming more tropical. Now, this NOAA graphic illustrates the movement of the boundary of the Hadley cell over time, which demarcates the meteorological tropics with their warm, moist, rising air masses. Global weather is becoming hotter, and global temperature minima, which set the range limits of many tropical organisms, are becoming less severe, allowing them to expand along with rising temperatures into the temperate zone. Texans are no strangers to tropical organisms. In fact, this is one of the few states with truly tropical ecosystems. Way down in South Texas, in the Rio Grande Valley, tropical thorn scrub and palm woodland communities host a variety of neotropical organisms more commonly associated with Mexico and Central America. These ecosystems are very poorly known within the United States, but host a disproportionate share of our biodiversity. Every year, members of these communities, especially the birds and insects, move a little further north into the rest of Texas and beyond. However, the tropicalization of the world doesn't just mean new birds for your life list. It also means that a variety of environmental challenges associated with the tropics are growing worse, and we're not prepared for the consequences. Tropical diseases, including Zika, chikungunya, and Chagas disease, are moving north and are increasingly prevalent in the United States. Hurricanes and other tropical weather systems are also moving away from the equator, buoyed on warmer seas, and bringing higher and higher storm surges. The reduction in freezing days is also facilitating the invasion of many tropical organisms that have become established in the southern United States, weakening the annual kills that used to control their population. All of these global trends, connections, and challenges intersect in complicated ways, which is why the study of tropical ecosystems and tropical environmental issues needs to be an inherently interdisciplinary affair. For instance, there is a complex feedback between deforestation and all the socio-political trends that drive it, with local fire patterns, regional rainfall trends, and the global climate system that threatens to shift the Amazon basin from primarily a rainforest to a savanna, and from primarily a carbon sink to a carbon source. There are also complex interrelationships between deforestation, climate change, the global wildlife trade, and emerging disease threats, as increasing human-wildlife contact causes spillover of zoonotic diseases such as COVID-19. So to highlight the interdisciplinary nature of these issues and foster collaboration in tackling them, we've created the Texas Tropical Network. The inspiration for the network came from our very own speaker tonight, Rhett Butler, who started the Bay Area Tropical Forest Network a few years back. As a native of the San Francisco Bay Area, I had the opportunity to attend several of those events, which brought together everyone from researchers in remote sensing to indigenous activists from the heart of the Amazon rainforest. Now we're hoping to replicate that success in Texas by hosting a series of speakers, meetings, and networking events that unite people across different disciplines at Texas universities and connect them both to other members of the community with an interest in tropical conservation and sustainable development, and with people living in the global tropics and working directly on these issues. So if you'd like to find out more or join our email list, please go to texastropicalnetwork.org. And with that, I'd like to again thank our sponsors, Far Coffee, the Brazil Center, the School of Journalism and Media, the Green Fund, and the Biodiversity Center. I'm going to give it back to Keaton to introduce our speaker, Rhett. I just want to mention before I do that we have one more event with Rhett before he has to go back home. So tomorrow at 4 p.m., we're going to be talking about the state of the world's tropical forests over in NHB 1.720. That's going to be at 4 p.m. And after the event, we're probably going to walk over to Crown and Anchor and do a little happy hour with Rhett so people can talk a little bit more about these issues. So we hope to see you there. Thank you very much for your time. And I'm going to give it back to Keaton now.
Thanks, Eric. So it really is an honor to be able to introduce Rhett Butler at this event. Like I said, this is someone who their work and the work of everyone over at Mongabay was part of what brought me into journalism back in the beginning. I want to just kind of summarize what I know about how this all got started. Is, you grew up with an interest in animals, had the opportunity to travel around the world, seeing some rainforests in Southeast Asia, in Latin America as well. And then the way that Mongabay, from my understanding, got started was in college. Rhett, you were working on a book about this, and the publisher of the book, when it actually, when it got to that point, didn't want to include photos in that because of like financial reasons. So he said, hey, why not just put it online? And it kind of started as simple as that, wanting to get it out there. Ended up being, so popular and getting a lot of traffic on these stories about biodiversity in the rainforest that it was generating ad revenue. And at a certain point, that led to being able to quit a job in Silicon Valley and do environmental journalism. And where has that led? Now there are, I believe, 5 or 6 bureaus publishing original journalism in not just English, but Hindi, Indonesian, Portuguese, Spanish, to name a few, and then a network of independent journalists that are contributing to Mongabay in 80 countries. So really a worldwide operation that has a focus on investigative journalism, for one, a lot of using satellite imagery to go and find illegal deforestation, and also journalism that's more informational, explanatory, to help the public understand these issues, and also policymakers and decision makers around the world. So it has a very high impact for some of the, from coming from very humble beginnings and still growing to this day. So that's very exciting. I believe it was around 2013, there was a decision to stop being advertising based and then become a nonprofit, which is something that is very relevant. Nonprofit newsrooms in the world of journalism are a big deal, and we need successful, thriving ones. So that gives you a little bit of kind of what it means to be also delivering environmental journalism with the idea of inspiration from nature's front lines, is kind of the tagline there that I'm sure, Rhett, you'll talk a little bit more about what that means. And so that is to bring it to this day. You've won many awards. I'm sure I haven't researched them all, but a Heinz Award for the environment most recently, which is a very big honor. So we're happy to have you here, and I'm going to give it over to you. Everyone, welcome Rhett Butler.
Does that work or no? Yes.
Yeah, that works.
Okay. Well, thank you for that very generous introduction, Keaton, and also Eric. It's a real pleasure to be here. I've actually never been to UT Austin before. I've been to Austin, but the university, I've been having a great time so far. I've done a bunch of talks, and I have to apologize if you've come to any of my talks the past 2 days. There may be some parts that are repetitive, but hopefully that's okay. Great. So I was going to start with some background on Mongabay. I feel like Keaton already did a good job introducing some of the context, but maybe I'll just rehash a little bit of it. First, I guess, what is Mongabay if you're not familiar with it? So we are a news outlet that focuses on the intersection of people and nature in geographies where we feel like our journalism can have an impact. We're structured with 6 regional bureaus in 6 languages. We have about 90 staff currently. We'll probably be around 100 by the end of the year. And we have 1,000 contributing journalists in about 80 countries. We produce written content. That's kind of our biggest chunk of content. Produce about 1,500 videos across all the languages a year. Those are mostly short form videos. And then we have some podcasts. As Keaton mentioned, we are a nonprofit. We get most of our revenue now from foundations and individual donors. Advertising is less than 0.1% of our revenue. So went from 100% 20 years ago to less than 1%. We distribute content via our website, get 3 to 4 million people coming to our website a month, various social media channels, and then third-party sites. So there's a lot of outlets that syndicate our content, especially in India and Latin America. We have very mainstream media outlets that are republishing our stories. I'll get into that a little bit later. So again, I kind of already heard the backstory, but essentially when I was a little kid, I really liked frogs and lizards. I had the great fortune of having a mother who's a travel agent and a father who traveled a lot for business. So he had airline miles. And my family prioritized travel. And I would, because I thought the cool lizards and frogs were in the rainforest, I would lobby to go to the rainforest. And then eventually I was able to go to Eastern Ecuador near Yasuni National Park, which is one of the most biodiverse places on Earth. We stayed with a fairly traditional indigenous community, and I had an amazing time looking for frogs and fish and things like that. Came back a few months later. There was a story in the San Francisco Chronicle about this oil spill that happened on the Rio Napo upriver from where I'd been. And so that area I visited was now coated in an oil slick. And so that really made me concerned about my friends in the forest and the animals. And so that's what moved me from someone who liked cool frogs to someone who is starting to monitor environmental issues, especially around rainforests. So the thing that moved me to action was when I was in high school, I had the opportunity to go to Borneo. So this is Sabah in Malaysian Borneo. This is one of the most biodiverse parts of Southeast Asia. So lots of amazing animals there, including cool frogs and lizards. So, beautiful forest. I kept in correspondence with the scientists there. So this is before I had a personal email account. So I was writing letters. And later I learned that the forest was pulped to make paper, and now it's an oil palm plantation. So it went from looking like that to like this. And so when that forest was destroyed, it inspired me to try to do something. So again, my evolution was from liking nature to reading about the environmental issues, then to actually do something. So when I was in college, as Keaton mentioned, I began writing a book about rainforests. So my major was economics management science, which is like math, econ, and finance. But I was very passionate about this. So I did independent study and worked on rainforests. I would work during the summer, but save money to do a little trip. And I was doing derivatives trading. I graduated a year early thanks to AP credit. And so I spent that extra year working on the book. I was trading derivatives to pay my rent. Finished the book, went through peer reviews. As Keaton mentioned, the publisher didn't have money to put pictures in the book. So I decided, I didn't write this book for money, I wrote it for impact. And so I decided to put it on the internet so people could read it for free. And I named it after this island off Madagascar. So this island is really special to me. So it's covered with rainforest. It actually was deforested at one point, but the rainforest came back, so it shows that recovery is possible. And it's full of all sorts of amazing animals, from chameleons to those leaf geckos to lemurs. And it's surrounded by coral reefs, and there's a population of humpback whales nearby. So very beautiful island. And so I anglicized the name so it would be totally unique. Because back in the day, if you searched Alta Vista or Excite and you typed in Mongabay, the only thing that would come up would be my website. So I could see who was referencing it and everything else. So that's the reason I did it. I didn't set out trying to build a popular website. But the reality was I wasn't going to run a website for a living. And so I started working for a Silicon Valley company, a small one. So as I would do my work during the day, but nights and weekends I'd work on the website. And then as time went on, it's like grew more popular. And then in 2001, I'd actually written a book earlier, and the rights reverted back to me in 2001. So I then put that website, or I put that content on the website as well. And that was about tropical freshwater fish. So, it seems very obscure, but if you go to the pet store, most of the fish there that aren't saltwater fish will be tropical freshwater aquarium fish. So I had written a book about that, looking at the ecology of these fish, because most of the literature out there really didn't talk about where they came from. So those two things, were on the website. Site started real popular. I decided to quit my job and pursue my passion once I started bringing advertising revenue. So it was definitely a step down from having a real job, but I felt like I could try it and make it work. So one of the first things I did once I started doing Mongabay full time is I created this news service not news service. I created this section for children about rainforests, and I had it adapted into about 40 languages by native speakers. I then started taking pictures everywhere I traveled, so I wouldn't have a problem not having images anymore. And then I started the news service. And so this is what Mongabay is best known for. The first few years of the news service, it was just me in my pajamas writing articles, traveling around talking to experts, but it was not like a big thing. People thought it was much bigger than it was, but it really wasn't. Eventually I brought on an intern named Jeremy Hance, and then and then I hired him. And so it was the two of us, and we were doing this. And it was great, but I had all these ideas I wanted to pursue that there was no advertising business model for. So for example, Indonesia seemed to be at a potential inflection point where it could tip from a deforestation driven economy to something that was kind of like Brazil in the mid 2000s, where it kind of shifted from separating deforestation from economic growth. And in Indonesia, a lot of the deforestation and environmental degradation is driven by corruption in the natural resources sector. And I thought, well, journalism is an intervention that could actually help make a difference, because by increasing transparency, you can increase accountability, in the space. So maybe I could, maybe if Indonesia had better environmental news coverage, it could help make a difference. So with that in mind, I decided to form a nonprofit so I could go out and try to raise money to start an Indonesian language news service. So I don't speak Indonesian. I just saw it as being an opportunity. And so I was successful in finding a foundation and getting a grant. I announced that I was going to be hiring people in Indonesia, and I announced that in English and Indonesian. And because my English coverage was getting a lot of coverage, or it was getting a lot of exposure in Indonesia, we were already pretty well known. So we got just a whole bunch of applicants. And so I went over to Indonesia, interviewed the top 40 candidates, and then hired a team. We launched the site 2 months later. And within a month of launching, it was the most popular Indonesian language news service. And so it really took off fast. And it really had very little to do with me. It was, I just brought together the resources and found the right people who are then able to take this forward. So, they would ask me for advice sometimes, but, usually not. And they would, and then we learned a lot from Indonesia. So Indonesia had very high social media adoption rates, like way ahead of the US. And so we're able to test certain things in Indonesia and then bring it to the global Mongabay and, replicate the successes they had. And so one of the things they did very early on was build this network of contributors. And so we saw that, and then we eventually did it globally. And so this kind of shows Mongabay's trajectory after that. So Mongabay in Indonesia became a model for expansion into other geographies and languages. So you can see in 2011, 2 people, we added Indonesia. 2016, we started to scale up Mongabay Latam, which is Spanish. And then, the rest is kind of history. But, we've continued to grow. And this year we're adding Africa. So Africa initially is going to be bilingual, French and English. The reason for that is we're targeting key decision makers, and we find that key decision makers in most of the countries we're focusing on. So in West, Central, Southern, and East Africa, one of those two languages is spoken by the majority of key decision makers. We do have a strategy for reaching other audiences through partnerships, but that's more like phase 2. So anyway, we do currently have an Africa desk in our global bureau, and that will be spun out into this new Africa bureau, and then we'll be hiring several more staff. So by the end of the year, we'll probably have 8 to 10 people in the Africa bureau. And so this is what it looks like numerically in terms of staff and contributors. You might notice that we have quite a lot of representation in South Asia and Southeast Asia. That's because India and Indonesia are 2 of our large bureaus. We also have quite a few people in LATAM, but Africa is not particularly strong compared to the other regions. So with the establishment of Mongabay Africa, we would, those numbers will increase a lot across the continent. So this is the depressing part of the talk. Hopefully I won't bum anyone out or not bum me out too much. So I'm going to talk about some of the trends in journalism. So I'm sure everyone's aware that it's a challenging time for the journalism space. So one of the main challenges is the shift in the business model. So compared to, starting about, well, basically with the rise of the internet, and then it kind of got worse with social media, the economics of the business changed a lot. So when classified ads kind of went away and were replaced by other things, the amount of resources in journalism just collapsed. And so you had a lot of bankruptcies, a lot of outlets shutting down, a lot of layoffs, pay cuts, things like that. And so these are just some of the ones from the past year. And some of these are, bankruptcies, and some of them are just, cutting staff. But the reality is that it's a tough time for journalism, even some of the real marquee names like New York Times. So one of the other challenges is consumption of news is collapsing really around the world. So this is from this great report that comes out every year from the Reuters Institute at Oxford, but it shows news consumption over the past several years, or people who are interested in news. And so in most markets, it's falling quite dramatically. There are reasons for this, ranging from sort of burnout. 2020 especially was a rough year, so that was sort of like a cliff for a lot of news consumption, or 2021, just given everything going on in the world. So some people are getting burned out. People are losing trust in journalists or in journalism and in news. So this is another major challenge. And so there's other ways to look at this. This is just another, this is from Pew. No matter what source you're looking at, it's similar. So this just shows, how many people are checking or are looking at news via these various platforms. You can see the sometimes and often is pretty much going down across most platforms. And then there are people who actively avoid the news. This is, similar data, but essentially, across almost all countries, the number of people who are avoiding news is going up. So it's about 40% of people currently worldwide are avoiding news. I think it's similar or slightly higher in the US. So another challenge sort of in this space is the degradation of the information ecosystem. So there's this tsunami of information coming in. News sources have fragmented and diversified. So there used to be, tons of local media outlets. Now there's a few large media outlets, and then there's social media. And so the data sources have also greatly expanded. So there used to be places you would, there's just a few places people would check. You kind of had common conversations. Now, like, you have no idea where information is coming from, how factual it is and everything else. And so that has significant implications. So algorithms are also increasingly determining who sees what. So rather than, curation by an editor, it's, a black box that's showing us information. Fake news. So people don't know how to distinguish between what's real and what's not real. So the loss of that discernment, I think, is the discernment skill is really important. I also think a secondary issue is people don't necessarily care whether something is based on facts or not. I'm not saying that's everyone, I think, but there's a large percentage of the population that really cares about whatever meets their current, whatever sort of fits their worldview. Another challenge is distribution. So So a lot of, I mean, like Facebook and Twitter are banning news. I mean, they're muting news, but they're also banning news. So this has gotten quite controversial lately with a lot of the disasters happening in the world. So like Facebook has banned news in Canada, for example, and there are these fires, and people who rely on Facebook for news, could get information about fires. And just generally, social media is increasingly a pay to play environment. So if you want to reach your subscribers or people who like your page, you have to pay to reach them. You're not going to get organic distribution. So this just shows news consumption or where people get their news from on various platforms. And you can see on almost every social media platform, news consumption is also declining. The TikTok is sort of the one that's going the other direction, but it's it's a trend across everywhere. So people are just bummed out on news, basically. It's also just becoming hard for, I mean, the whole social media landscape, even if you're dependent on a news outlet, it changes. The algorithms are changing so quickly, and what's popular is changing as well. And so it's a difficult place to navigate. So this just shows social media usage by 18 to 24s. And you can see, I mean, everyone knows, Facebook is declining, and the various things are changing position. It was Instagram for a while, now Instagram's declining. Anyway, so it's confusing from a media standpoint, where the landscape was very well defined for decades, and then having to sort of like look at this and be like, I'm not sure what to do. So anyway, it's a complex information ecosystem. Another challenge, especially internationally, but I mean to a degree here as well, is rising authoritarianism. So shrinking press freedoms in a lot of countries. So fake news is being dressed up as a way to go after journalists now. Basically in countries like Malaysia, Singapore, if you publish something that the government doesn't like, it's considered fake news, and then you're facing all sorts of potential problems. There's also just a lot more restrictions on journalism, and if you're a foreign correspondent trying to get a visa in some countries, it can be really hard now. There's increasing criminalization of journalism. So, this can look like, I mean, it can be outright arrests, but it can also be things like raiding your office for, like a tax issue. There, these strategic litigation against public participation lawsuits. We've had to deal with these before. Journalists are being targeted with violence and harassment. And it's also an issue that extends to sources. So it's not just the journalists, but the people who the journalists rely on for getting their stories. So as a journalist, you have to think about, when I do this reporting, is it going to put lives at risk? You really have to think through, even if you're using an anonymous source, people can figure out who they are. What is your story going to end up doing to people you rely on for your information? Something we've personally experienced in Indonesia is kind of this opacity from individuals, where you can't get official information if they don't like you. So it's only trusted sources who will, parrot the government's line that will actually get, information. And then of course, surveillance. So journalists are very heavily targeted in some countries by hackers, often government hackers, but also other entities, which is challenging. That said, so we're past like the really dark part of this. We're moving into the upside of some of the trends. So there is some upside. So one of the things is that because the effects of environmental degradation are getting more and more apparent to everyone in the world, it means the market for people who are interested in environmental news is rising. So that's the downside of having all these natural disasters, is they are relevant to more people. There's also been this rise in big data. So just this increase in data sources, whether it's satellites to leaked documents, and then also, really importantly, the capacity to analyze and distill information from sort of those huge bodies of data. And then open source intelligence is like has gotten to be a really great resource for journalism. There's also new types of partnerships that are rising. So I mean, just one example that's very relevant to Mongabay is the Pulitzer Center for Crisis Reporting. They give out grants for reporting on certain topics. So they have like a rainforest fund, and they have an oceans fund. And so they will give travel grants to journalists who will go out into the field and then do reporting for Mongabay or reporting for the New York Times. And so that helps deal with some of the heavy costs of getting to some of these remote places. new business models. So for a while, subscriptions were kind of coming back. I feel like they've kind of leveled off a bit, but people are willing to pay for high quality content, which is very different from say like 15 or 20 years ago. And then there's rising philanthropic interest. So Mongabay is a nonprofit, which we'll talk about later, but there is a thriving market now for nonprofit journalism. So that was something that was pretty rare 10 or 15 years ago. And then, of course, new tools, so new ways to reach people, new ways to engage them, new way to present information. So that's all very helpful. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how Mongabay is responding to some of these things because it might be, useful or relevant. So I mean, the first thing is we shifted to a nonprofit. So that shift began in 2012 with Indonesia, and then by 2015, I shifted all news over to the nonprofit. So I donated all the content that I had, generated the previous 10 or 12 years or whatever, and put it into the nonprofit. And so one of the things that did for us is that we could then we didn't have to worry about page views anymore and advertising revenue. We could give away our content for free for anyone to use, commercially or non-commercially, because ultimately our goal is impact, not page views. So if New York Times New York Times doesn't post our stories, but if a mainstream media outlet in Indonesia or in Peru or in India can republish our story and get millions of people seeing it, ultimately that's a win for us. So another way to put that is quality of engagement over quantity of engagement. So distribution. So we're looking at we're always looking at new channels, formats, and platforms to reach and engage audiences. Whether that's social media, it's different ways to present information, new partnerships. We're consistently evaluating sort of the performance of social media to decide what to focus on. I think I talk about this later, but essentially one of the big things for us was essentially abandoning Facebook, or I guess deprioritizing Facebook. So instead of investing staff time in making Facebook posts, in 2021, we decided to just automate Facebook because we just didn't feel like the platform was that valuable. So at the time, we were getting about 200 million impressions via Facebook or on Facebook or Facebook channel per month or channels per month. So it's now less than 100,000. So that's like a huge collapse. And so that equates to about 4 million visits a month that we lost. But the overall time people spent on Mongabay actually increased. So that 4 million users had no value. So it was garbage traffic. And if we really care about impact, then 4 million visitors who that they don't do anything except look at something for a few seconds really just aren't worth our time. So that was a bold decision that ended up working out, and it's just accelerated for us. So I already mentioned the open Creative Commons license, which means anyone can use our content. We've been establishing more collaborations to pool resources and expand reach. So again, the best example of this is Latin America. So we have a ton of partnerships from Mexico down to Chile, where we do joint investigations, really deep investigations that one outlet really can pull off by itself. We also have, just a lot of syndication partners. And then we do things on the site like, we cite sources for scientific articles with references to papers, to try to get around like, where is your information coming from, to show that it's based off of research. And this is very common now, but when we added it, it was a little bit novel, but adding bullet point summaries to the top of every article. We did that in like 2015, and back then it was kind of unusual. It's a way for people to, there was a concern that if you put bullet point summaries at the top of an article, people would just look at that and leave. It actually did the opposite. It actually increased the average time spent on the site because some people would read that and then it would draw them in and they would spend more time on it rather than just bouncing right off. So diversification, so we're adding new languages, geographies, and also voices to reach markets where we feel like our journalism can have impact. So one of the priorities for us over the next several years is trying to reach people who have historically been underserved or marginalized with this environmental coverage, as these people who are directly impacted by, or who are most impacted by climate change and environmental degradation, trying to get the information in their hands. Also, when we go out and do reporting, from an Indigenous community, trying to ensure that that information gets back to them, because if you have a journalist come in, say from, I don't know, Brasilia or something, and go into the Amazon and stay with the community, then leave, and they never hear about what resulted from it, it doesn't seem like a fair exchange. And so, being much more intentional about getting that information back to the communities who have contributed. There's some style choices we make to try to reach to try to sort of deal with some of these issues. So one is that we strive to write in a general interest or non-technical style to cut through the silos. So Mongabay's audience isn't like the general person. Like, we're not necessarily trying to maximize our reach. We're really trying to focus on certain user groups who we feel like can result in impact. So those are people who work. So for example, in the private sector, it'd be people who are managing commodity supply chains. So thinking about where their palm oil comes from. It would be people who are making decisions around investments. Within governments, it would be people working in the agencies that manage natural resources, so like fisheries and environment and forestry. It would be the overseas development agencies like USAID that control large funds of large sources of funding for conservation. It would be the NGOs and activists and indigenous communities. So we have these specific user groups that we're targeting, and they often speak their own languages. But if we write in a common style, you can cut through those silos. And then the byproduct of that is, because you're writing in a general interest format, you get a broader general interest audience as well, even if that's not your primary market. And we also, try to obviously use like good titles and graphics and engaging images. We try to avoid clickbait because that just disappoints people. And it's really, that's more like an advertising model anyway. So some of the things that we're doing, like on the content front, is we're investing more in data-driven reporting. And so I'll get into this a little bit, but one of the major data sources for us now is satellites. We're envisioning doing more with also bioacoustic data, because we just think there's a lot to unlock there. We're using a lot of that for investigations, but we're also doing more traditional investigations as well. And then of course frontline reporting. So about 20, I don't know, 18 to 20% of Mongabay staff is in the US, so it's a small minority, and a small minority of our contributors are in sort of like the global north. So most of our team and our contributors are in the global south. So we have a lot of opportunities for frontline reporting. We're also starting to do things, develop content that goes beyond news. So there's some decision support tools, which is basically like taking data that we've originally gathered for reporting and then putting it in a format where you just are accessing the data. So for example, we've built this reforestation app. It's pretty much an alpha still, but it's a directory of reforestation projects. Because one of the things we found is that there's not a lot of transparency around tree planting, despite all the hype. And so we're not acting as like a certifier, or we're not passing judgment on it. It's purely around disclosure. But by asking by leading people through a series of questions, they can understand what sorts of things they should be thinking about before they invest in or donate to a tree planting project. We also have a platform called Conservation Effectiveness, which looks at what does the science actually tell us about what works in conservation and what doesn't. We're also developing educational content, so that's both content targeted towards certain youth audiences, but also explainers, which are more for adults or specific audiences like journalists. We've also increased our solutions coverage. So some of the reporting projects we've had in this space have been like indigenous-led conservation, which is still ongoing, wild tech, which is our name for our conservation technology project, agroforestry, agroecology. So we find that many journalists won't by default sort of do solutions journalism. You kind of have to frame something that way. So I think sort of for many journalists, like the default is, if there's a solution that's 90% positive, then focus on the 10% that's not working. The problem, I mean, that's kind of like conventional, but the problem is that with people getting burned out on negative news, sometimes you just need to flip the script a little bit, and you can still talk about all the problems, but you talk about them in terms of how you're trying to solve those problems. So it's like a relatively minor thing, but it actually requires quite a lot of resources to do good solutions journalism, because you don't want to be just doing PR or hyping something that doesn't actually work. And just to build a little bit off that. So this is again this Reuters study, but so this is among people who say they avoid the news. So I only saw this like yesterday, and I thought it was really interesting because we intentionally started to scale up our news coverage. So because we had a kind of like an intuition that there were people who were turning out who were not paying attention to the news because they were getting burned out by it. But it turns out that the top thing that people who avoid the news say they're interested in when it comes to news are positive stories, solution stories, explainers. So it's kind of interesting that, yeah, I mean, we were spot on with that. And it's a good thing. So there is a good reason to invest in, that kind of reporting. You can sort of engage people who wouldn't otherwise be engaged because they're burned out. This is also kind of interesting. So this shows the political divide. So left is the dark circles, right is the light circles. And so you can see that certain topics, people identify as being on the right aren't interested in, or they tune out from. And so climate change and environmental news is at the top there. So one way to think about this, is, oh, I can't, like, this sucks and I can't cover environmental news. Another way is to say, well, what if I do climate change and environmental news through different framing, like, talking about the business of it or the economics of these issues, or tying in, like the local aspects of it, or like the security implications of climate change. So it's like another way to frame it. If you want to reach an audience that typically, isn't, doesn't want to read your news, there are other ways to reach that audiences and certain topics that will resonate with them. So it's just another way to kind of think about these issues if you're trying to get more people informed. Yeah, so this talks a little bit about the future. So Mongabay is, we've done news reporting for a long time. We've had an internship program for a long time. Last year, we launched a paid fellowship program for young and aspiring and transitional journalists. And transitional journalist means someone who's maybe like a sports reporter who wants to start covering the environment. So we have these opportunities for them to work directly with a mentor and get paid for it and produce journalism, which is really great in terms of building a portfolio and a name for themselves. We also do issue-focused webinars for journalists. So there's a bunch of stuff that we're developing. So we're trying to provide more tools and training to help journalists stay safe in the field, given the various issues that do exist in many places where we work. We're also trying to do a better job of telling our own story. Like, I'm not a marketing person, so I never really focus on telling Mongabay's story. I just focused on, doing the work. But I know that that's a gap for us. And so I've started to prioritize more of telling that story and actually hired someone to help with that and just highlighting the great work that our journalists themselves are doing. So what is the story behind the story? We're going to be launching a short form news service that accomplishes a bunch of goals, but one of those goals, well, aspires to accomplish a bunch of goals. One of those is as I already mentioned, is to provide access for underserved audiences, and also supporting video and more collaborations and social media. But one of the ways to reach those audiences it's much easier to establish partnerships with other outlets that are, say, publishing in, I don't know, Pidgin or Tamil, if they're shorter form articles. So that's part of the ambition of it. And then also adapting content into different formats. So for example, like audio. So in parts of Latin America, a lot of people use, voice messages on WhatsApp. And so if we could have these articles that are automatically adapted into, with using a local dialect into a message, it could be a way to reach people who don't, read the news or have great internet access. So there's things like that we're looking at that we expect to become very important for us for, achieving some of these goals to reach some of these audiences. We're also in the midst of a major site and app redesign. We're developing more tools and visualizations, and we're going to continue expanding into places and on topics where we feel like our children could have impact. So one of the areas that we are going to be doing more coverage is around toxics, so like plastic waste and issues like that. It has not been a major focus for us, but we are going to be scaling that up. And so I'm almost done. I know I've been talking for a long time. So one of the other critical things, that underpins a lot of what we do is just to focus on impact. So we have built impact tracking infrastructure within Mongabay to try to understand the quantitative and qualitative impacts that are related to our journalism. So quantitative is pretty easy to understand. That's things like the number of stories, the number of videos, the readership, viewership, the social media activity, the syndication and republishing. The qualitative I find to be much more interesting. It's a lot harder to collect because it's basically anecdotal. You also can't assign or take credit for, you're reporting, you can't attribute 100% of the impact of what you're doing, but you can say, we did this reporting and then something happened afterwards. Someone else can connect the dots. So those are things like the use of our content for decision making. So like we know that the US Treasury Department used our oceans investigation to sanction this Chinese tuna fishing company. It was actually just a front for shark finning, for example. Policy change. So like a company adopting a zero deforestation commitment after we've done reporting on, something they've done. Law enforcement action. So it might be a public prosecutor investigating environmental crimes that one of our journalists has surfaced. It's replications of ideas. So things like a community that has a reforestation approach that after we do a story about it, they get funding from the UN or other communities contact them to get information so they can replicate the idea. So a little bit about journalism impact. So, most basically, I think everyone's aware that, by covering issues, journalism, raises awareness. So both among key target audiences, but around the general public. And so that, results in all sorts of things. But another thing journalism does is it can increase transparency and accountability. And so this can be really important because if you have, say, a mayor in Bolivia who's allowing a logging in a national park, just by exposing that fact, it can very quickly drive outcomes. So our reporting isn't telling people what to think, but it's providing information that enables people to make decisions. So I talk about it that way because our journalism, I don't think of it as being advocacy journalism. We're presenting information and then people do things with that information. Journalism also fosters an enabling environment for a wide range of actors. And so like a good way to think about this is in a place like Malaysia, because of the restrictions on the press, local media often cannot break stories. So there may be something going on that the media can't really report on. So Mongabay as a foreign outlet can run a story, and then the local media can then point to the Mongabay story and then basically blame Mongabay, but then they can build off it. And so it gives them legal cover for what they're doing. And so we found that especially in Malaysia, has been quite valuable. But just generally, awareness around these issues can benefit a whole wide range of actors from, indigenous communities to activists to, conservation organizations. They can also identify gaps and opportunities. So, this is the reason why a lot of funders work with us. So let's say they're, like an individual is really interested in elephant conservation and they're funding sort of like the traditional elephant conservation groups. So if a bunch of journalists independently go and do reporting on elephants, it might surface other NGOs that are doing good work or communities that are doing great work. It might identify groups that are not doing good work. It might identify some threats that people weren't really aware of, or some potential ways to help elephants that are currently not being funded. So those are all sort of things that can serendipitously result from journalism. And of course, journalism can inspire people and inspire action. So I apologize to anyone who's heard this already before in the past 2 days, but it is my favorite example. So I'm gonna bore you with it again. But so this is just like sort of a perfect example of how journalism can contribute to impact. So this is about a company called United Cacao that had an IPO in 2013 on the London Stock Exchange, and it was a cacao producer. And so cacao is used for making cocoa, which goes into chocolate. And so at the time, it was the only pure play cacao company that was publicly listed. And so it had this nice story about how it was sustainable and working with communities and all this other stuff. We weren't paying attention to that at all. We were just using this new platform called Global Forest Watch to look at what was happening with the world's forests, specifically deforestation. And so when this tool launched, I thought this could be amazing for journalism because we can just see what's popping up and then send people on the ground at ground truth and see if there's anything interesting. And so sure enough, in the Peruvian Amazon there was these pink polygons popping up. And it turned out researchers had been, monitoring this area for a while and had flown over it before with airplanes and mapped it, all the biodiversity, the carbon. And so we could see that this forest was being cleared and that it was indeed forest. And so we sent an investigative reporter who started to dig into it, and it turned out it was United Cacao that was clearing this forest. And so they were not actually, just growing cacao in a deforested landscape. They were doing the deforestation. They had claimed that it wasn't forest, but we had all the data showing that it was forest and the history of the trees falling down and everything else. So if you look at the high resolution imagery, you can see the trees are down. Those are trees, not scrub. That's not scrub. And so we reached out to United Cacao for comment before we published the story. We didn't hear from United Cacao, but we heard from their lawyers, and it was a major law firm, and they told us that they would sue us out of existence. We moved forward on the story. And my response to them was, we're publishing the story anyway. Because we have all, you don't have libel or slander. We have all the data here, and we're not after United Cacao. We're just reporting on what's happening. And so, do what you need to do. And so they dropped the company as a client. We went ahead and published the story even before that. And this is the first international coverage of this issue. And so it spread really quickly, and a bunch of other outlets started covering it, like The Guardian and other ones. NGOs started to do campaigns against the company, and all that pressured the government to look into it. And it turned out that United Cacao was doing this clearing without the right permit, so their operating permit was revoked. And then 2 years later, they were delisted from the London Stock Exchange. And so the reason that was important was it had been trying to raise more money on the stock exchange to clear another 100,000 hectares of forest. And so by being delisted and losing that access to capital, they didn't clear that forest. And so if you want to put that in carbon terms, it's about 29 million a million metric tons of CO2 emissions avoided. And so again, that's not all Mongabay's, Mongabay contributed that away, but it was really all these different actors who came together, so the enabling environment that made that happen. So we played a part in it, a small part, but it was an exciting example of impact. So I have other impact stories, but I'll just leave it there so we have enough time for discussion. So thank you.
All right, we're gonna move into some Q&A. I have a few questions that I've been thinking up, and we'll start with that. And then open it up for everyone else to ask questions a little bit later. Well, thanks for a great talk and super interesting things that came up. I wanted to first ask you about, well, we're really in the midst of a lot of issues with climate change this summer. I feel like we've heard a whole lot about extreme heat and wildfires, but what are maybe 2 or 3 of the top overlooked climate stories right now that you can think of that aren't getting as much attention as the stories that have been more dominating the headlines related to climate change?
Well, I think one story which is kind of related to climate change, which is El Nino. So I think we're not appreciating just how devastating El Nino may be. I think we may just be underestimating how devastating El Nino could be if it's bad this year. So if you're not familiar, I mean, especially in the tropics. So El Nino, it can be really catastrophic in the Amazon and in Southeast Asia and other parts of the world. So, there could be huge fires across Indonesia, which could drive those, horrendous, huge carbon emissions, but also horrendous air pollution across Southeast Asia. So I think that's something that's not really being given enough attention right now. I also have to acknowledge that I am biased, like I focus more in the tropics that hit the US, but then also just the impact that the degree to which climate change is gonna drive drought in a lot of the world, and just what that lack of water security means for a lot of people. I mean, obviously it's big here, but just by virtue of the US having a lot of resources and wealth, we're much better able to adapt and respond to climate change that the most of the rest of the world. So, I mean, those would be the two things I would call out.
Thank you. Yeah, those are very big issues, and one thing that I thought of earlier when you were talking about, okay, this is the part of the talk that is going to depress people, and I thought that you were going to talk about climate change, but instead you talked about the state of journalism. So, but at the same time, I was listening to one of your interviews kind of recently where you said that you're an optimist. So I was wondering how, to put it bluntly, you know, with all of these things and being immersed not only in the world of biodiversity and also journalism, what are the things that make you optimistic, whether it's specific things going on that are positive, or is it more of a frame of mind, and how do you maintain that?
Yeah, so I mean, I think part of it is just my personality. It makes me an optimist, which is not very helpful for anyone, obviously. But one of the things that a lot of people have talked about, so it's not like my idea or anything, but is tipping points. And so we have these ecological tipping points, like the Amazon may trip to Savannah. We may lose the Gulf Stream and things like that. So those are scary, and sea ice. There's lots of them. But the other side of that is there are tipping points for addressing climate change. So one is like the adoption of EVs. I mean, so obviously there's a lot of issues with EVs, but EVs are still a step in a direction away from fossil fuels. And so if you look at like what's happening in, say, Norway, it's like over 80% of new cars are now EVs. So it's happening much faster than we projected. Same with like the cost of renewables. So like the price of renewable energy is like collapsed much faster than anyone forecast. So these things can happen. And the main question though is it happening fast enough to make a difference? Or like, can we avoid the worst outcomes? And so I might be a little less optimistic than I was a few years ago, because it feels like a lot of these things are I mean, we're still dealing with a lot of the same problems. Like climate denialism is coming back again. It was delayerism for a while, but now it's climate denialism coming back. And so it's disturbing. But I've always kind of believed that if people think they can make money from addressing climate change, like that's the best thing to sort of address climate change. Because all these people who don't really care about climate change, just want to make money, we start doing it. But the problem, as journalists, we need to think about, okay, what are the implications of if you're just trying to make money off climate change, like what's the downside from that? So like geoengineering, for example, like what's that going to do to oceans and other things. But yeah, I mean, it's really complex, but I tend to, when I see a problem, I tend to try to look for solutions. And so that's I guess that is what makes me an optimist. But I mean, there's certainly be a lot to be worried about, but I still think there are things to be hopeful for. And one of the things about sort of these extreme weather events, the fact they're so expensive and affecting so many people, is my hopes is that it's making people wake up and realize, oh, this is serious now, and we need to really deal with this problem, rather than being some kind of far off issue. But yeah, I think I'm a little bit less optimistic than I was when I did that interview, because it has been a frustrating few years.
Yeah, I mean, of course, there's always another kind of disaster that happens, it seems like, and that's just part of the world that we're getting used to. But at the same time, Mongabay has been very successful in the impact that you're talking about. And I love the example of Peru and the cacao company. But I think part of your goal is really, as public interest journalism, to be a driver of positive social change. So I was hoping, since we're talking about optimism, do you have a couple more examples like that you want to share of things that from your perspective are wins?
Yeah, so another example I like quite a bit is from the Congo Basin. So this was from 2 years ago now. So there was this community that had been, that had an ancestral forest that they'd been managing, for generations. And concession was granted to a Chinese logging company in this forest. And we had a local reporter who went and reported on this, and it caught the attention of the country's environment minister. And he went to go visit, and he was just supposed to be there for a few hours. He ended up staying there for 2 days, and he came back and he canceled the logging permit and
granted this recognition of this community forest. And the reason that's important is in Gabon, the forest conservation has traditionally been very top down. So this is like the first example that I know of a bottom up conservation project, and it basically creates a precedent for other communities to have their ancestral forests recognized. So it's really important from that standpoint. And hopefully that continues. I mean, obviously Gabon just had a coup, so there's a lot of uncertainty, but I think you need examples like that. Another reporting project that was, and I talked about this earlier, but wasn't in another class, but that I found really inspiring was it was called Amazon Women, and it was looking at female indigenous leaders across the Amazon who were doing amazing things in conservation. And so it achieved two things. So I mean, brought up visibility to the fact that indigenous people are leaders in conservation, which is something that wasn't as recognized maybe 5 years ago, but is now becoming very mainstream in the conservation space. And the other thing it did is it identified specifically women, which in a lot of indigenous communities don't necessarily have a voice, and so it was important from that standpoint too. I mean, so the two examples. I could do more if you want, but
Let's get one more. This is great. Yeah, let's do one more.
okay. So we've done some really deep investigations in Indonesia on the palm oil sector, and one of those investigations looked at this huge concession, which I may get the numbers right, but it was like 4,000 square kilometers, which is just a huge number. I don't know how it compares to the size of the states, but it's big. Essentially it was going to be granted for the soil pump concession. And so we had a team, we partnered with various outlets. So for that, it was the GECO project. And we just did a deep dive on it and the corruption around everything else. And eventually the company lost a permit. So that project has now moved forward. And it's, not just us, but it's, we contributed to that outcome. So, very positive for the whole communities and also, climate, obviously.
Yeah. Well, that definitely gives me a few reasons to be optimistic. So thank you for adding to that list of positive examples. It does make me think though of, something that's come up in a lot lately in discussions around journalism and solutions journalism in particular, and you kind of hinted at this. So I was wondering if we could talk a little more about this tension when trying to pursue solutions journalism, where you want to focus on things that are positive, but how do you make sure that you're preserving accuracy, which is like the first mission of speak truth and report it, and at the same time focusing on solutions without it being a fluff piece, but also without going into that news avoidance and being overly cynical. So just how do you, from an editorial standpoint, kind of approach balancing those two and doing really solid solutions journalism?
Well, yeah, I mean, facts have to certainly underpin everything we're doing, and you just can't compromise there, obviously. But a lot of times it's just framing. So again, if a solution is 80% successful, you don't want to cover up the part that's not working. You want to talk about where it's not working and why. And so I think you need to be transparent about the parts that aren't working, but you don't make the headline that like indigenous conservation areas are failing because they have a 20% deforestation in the community or whatever. It's like, no, it's the 80% that's working. And yes, there's some downside. There is some illegal logging happening, which is a problem. But if we compare it to other interventions, it's still much more effective than what those are. And so you're not going to cover anything up or misrepresent anything, but it's really just about the framing. It's like the half full versus half empty to a degree. One of the places where you do a lot of one of our beats sort of under solutions reporting is looking at conservation technology. And so in the conservation tech space, there's a lot of defense contractors that are trying to resell something that they used in the desert in a war as a conservation solution. And the reality is they don't work in the forest, or they're too expensive, or they're just not fit for purpose, or you need a team of engineers in Maryland to steer whatever it is. So really digging into that and trying to understand what actually works. And so cutting through the hype. And so, part of that is, some of the research you're gonna do, those aren't gonna be solution stories because they don't work. But you do find things that do work, and so those become part of your corpus of solutions journalism. But yeah, you can't ever mislead anyone or, have it be just PR or hype, because, you decide to write journalism.
I'll open it up in just a couple minutes for anyone else who has questions. But I wanted to ask, something else that I saw that Mongabay does a lot on is like mining, extraction industries. And here I just did a story yesterday as part of my fellowship at the Texas Tribune that was all about how industrial scale batteries are contributing to the grid in Texas. And that's a lot of lithium, for one, has some issues, and a lot of the other minerals. So from your reporting, what is the impact of some of the supply chains that are necessary for the clean energy transition? And what do we need to, what do you think that we need to be doing to make sure that we don't inadvertently cause more environmental damage in the transition to more renewable energies and electric vehicles?
I mean, yeah, this is a huge issue. A lot of the minerals that are needed for energy transition are very messy. It's very dirty the process, and you also, there's often a lot of social issues as well. So you're dispossessing communities of their lands. Like Indonesia is a great example. So nickel mining. So Indonesia is trying to become the EV, like a major cog in sort of the EV production, and a lot of that's around nickel. And that nickel lies under tropical forests, and so they're like strip mining forests for nickel, and then they're processing it and dumping the waste in the ocean. It's like the coral triangle. So it's really awful. So I mean, one of the problems is that portraying like electrification as being the silver bullet. I mean, you think about the whole supply chain. What does it actually mean? So there are things that you can do. I mean, there's look at recycling. I mean, there's a lot of garbage there's a lot of stuff that's being thrown away right now, like tech products and things like that. We can actually, it could be viable to start mining the e-waste basically for a lot of those materials. And then on the battery front, I mean, I was reading something the other day about sand batteries. So you just heat up sand and it will stay hot for months. And so it's a whole other thing. It's just like, I mean, it's so simple, it will never occur to me, but people are doing that. So I mean, there are solutions out there, but we need to be open-minded and also think about like the full cost of whatever we're producing. So things like when I read that sand battery article, my mind was kind of blown. I'm like, oh wow, that's just so amazing. I mean, now we're gonna have sand mining, or there'll be more sand mining. But the point is that there are things out there that can help us with this energy transition, but we shouldn't just throw out the baby with the bathwater. Just say, oh no, we've got to stay with fossil fuels, because there are things we can do to make this transition just and greener than what we currently have.
Thank you. And we've got about 15 minutes left, so we're going to open it up for audience questions. I think the easiest way, if that mic is working, Eric, can we get a mic check?
Check 1 2, check 1 2. No.
Ooh.
But I think Rhett's lapel mic might work still if you hold it up to you, and we can use this one for questions. It's still on.
If not, I'm just gonna have people raise their hands and shout it out, and I'll try to reiterate or come to you. Okay.
We'll just pass it back.
Yeah, so I think we should do, if people wanna, I think just raise your hand is probably the easiest. We're a small group here, so I think there's gonna be time for everyone's question. Who has a burning question? I know that somebody has to have one out there. Yeah, right here.
Can I pass you the mic? Folks on Zoom.
Thanks again, Rhett. I really enjoyed the talk today. So you made a point of emphasizing that you tried to document the consequences, the impacts of the articles that Mongabay puts out. How do you go about doing that? I mean, do you have people whose job is to look to try to sort of document downstream effects, and on what time frame?
Yeah, so what we try to do is leverage our reporting infrastructure. So the way that works is if someone does an investigation, then we have the editor reach back to them on say 3, 6, 12, 24-month intervals and say, can you go back to your sources and check in with them and see what's happened? And through that process, you can organically get some really interesting impact information. So that is one mechanism. Another mechanism is just listening. So that's like, social media listening, but also just, to our networks, and picking up stuff that way. So the first thing is the best way because, that's much more direct. And people's incentives are also aligned because a journalist may get another story out of it if, there's interesting things that have happened. And the editor is interested in understanding the impact of the work they're doing, and the funders, like hearing impact. So it's like, everything works really well there. The listening is much more, random, because you don't know what you're gonna get. But we have various tools for listening to social media and seeing comments and things. We also have people who reach out directly to us for that. And so all that stuff is then put in a database and it's tagged. So we would tag it with both this, well, usually it's just a story identifier, that's like the common thing. So if we have a palm oil reporting project, like we know every palm oil story. And so just by putting the URL there, then we can pull it from the database, if we do a query against like palm oil stories. So that's just how it works. It's pretty simple, I think, but it works well. I can always improve that, but it's pretty good. We've been using it for a while, and I think it's relatively unique in the space.
Next question, and Eric, if you're gonna pass back and forth, maybe if people have questions, they could line up over there, might be the easiest, like in this aisle. Or
don't all get up at once.
Yeah. Just because I don't want you to be running back to the end of the row and then coming back up here. So that's the most orderly way to do it.
So the statistics are showing us that science literacy, especially in America, is on the decline, as well as our trust in scientists. So as someone who runs a magazine or a website like this, a communication of science, how do you intersect scientists and communities to try to address people whose literacy and the information is falling?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really tough question. So people's trust in journalists is also falling. So we're in the same boat. Yeah, I mean, so I think it depends on what your goals are and who your audience is. So if you are trying to reach the mass market, then this is a question for you. Like for Mongabay, it's a little bit less of a question for us because we don't necessarily, like we're trying to reach decision makers. But traditionally what the approach we would take is there was a slide there which showed people's political affiliation. So you look for the opportunities for crossover. So you may have someone who doesn't believe in climate change, but they believe in breathing clean air, or they're concerned about the health of their kids, or they believe in just the whole idea of renewing the earth and things of that nature. So you want to look for those common elements which people can relate to. And maybe the best messenger is not a scientist, but having a scientist talk to a journalist or someone, or maybe even a religious figure. That's been a big thing in the climate movement, is finding religious figures who, people who are well respected, have them deliver a message, because people don't like scientists who don't believe scientists. And so, it's both the message, but also the messenger that can be important.
Okay. Thank you. Hi. So I was a little bit disturbed to see the graph that you had put in the presentation that showed that people are getting more news from TikTok and less news from basically all other sources except for TikTok. And I think that's concerning because of how algorithm driven TikTok is, and especially like amongst young people, it's really facilitating like this loss in attention span that I think means that people are less engaged with issues overall, less connected to the stream of like environmental information that they're getting. So my question is, how do you think that like journalists and news outlets can really start to reach younger audiences who are moving away from traditional news sources and towards like these faster paced, attention driven outlets instead?
Yeah, so I agree with you that it's kind of terrifying. So one of the things I've done when I travel, just like the last 20 years, I ask people how they get information. And it used to be Google search. And then it was YouTube, which was pretty scary. And now it's TikTok, which is even scarier. So I don't know what's next, but it's not good for the information ecosystem. So like with Mongabay, we find that our content does not work on TikTok. We are not good at TikTok. So I'm not the best person to answer the question, but I suspect it's something around like having personalities, people with personalities who can do TikTok, talking about these issues. The problem is I don't think the format lends well to nuance or depth, and so it's really challenging. And so it's like, you know, me getting bitten by a spider in the Amazon, and that's like good TikTok content, but there's no actual content there, like nothing of substance. So I think what it is though, if you're trying to make a play on TikTok, I think it's probably someone who is charismatic and engaging, who can talk in very short sound bites on those platforms and be interesting as they do it. So having journalists, you know, tell a little bit about, you know, the backstory behind the reporting and try to keep people on long enough to, you know, engage them and have them take away something. But I think generally, I mean, I would say that it's not good if people are relying on TikTok for getting informed on climate change and other issues. So it's part of the degradation of the information ecosystem, unfortunately. With that, a better answer.
Thanks for coming to me, by the way, I really appreciate it. So I believe you showed a graphic earlier on in your presentation about kind of the somewhat increase in maybe not necessarily interest, but in awareness of environmental issues, whether that be from a literal scientific standpoint or simply just from a standpoint of just simple care. And I was wondering what like more specifically, what do you think was the catalyst, if you will, for that, and also kind of tag along with the last person's question, what does that mean for like the age demographic of the importance of environmental issues? So is that increase a result of a multi-generational increase in interest, or is that more as a result of the newer generation having a different take overall than the last generation?
Yeah, so I don't think I have the depth of knowledge or data to really give a great answer on this. I mean, you can sort of speculate, whatever that's worth, but I feel like often young people are more concerned about the environment, and then as they age, they focus on other things. And so currently a lot of Gen Z, sorry, I can't remember this was or anything, but currently a lot of young people are pretty angry about, like, you know, my parents and grandparents like left us with this. This is like our problem now. Like, you know, it's not fair. And so there's a lot of uproar about it. But I'm not sure how that translates to action necessarily. I think a lot of activists are doing a lot, but I don't know if that extends across like a significant share of the population. Like, it's one thing to be angry and click, I don't know, the angry emoji or whatever on the platform, but that doesn't really do anything. So yeah, I mean, that's not really helpful. But so I would say that, you know, the reason that environmental issues are more relevant to people is that we have all these problems that are very severe, and people are like, I don't have power, or I don't have heat, or it's really hot outside, things like that. So I'm just not sure how it's going to translate to action yet. I just hopefully it'll translate to action. I feel like it should, but I've been wrong about things before, so I'm not sure. But theoretically, I think, and again, I talked about this already, but I mean, I feel like when money's involved, like in America, like money is so important that if people are losing a lot of money, and this is costing a lot of money, then they're gonna do something. And I mean, I wish that had happened 20 years ago, but it feels like it's getting just so egregiously expensive and damaging that more and more people are gonna have a vested interest in this. And so those tend not to be the under 25s, those are the older people. And so my hope is a combination of sort of generational outrage of, you know, you screwed us over, you know, like this isn't fair. So that sort of aspect combined with this is costing us a lot of money, that will actually lead to real action. But I don't have any particular, you know, inside knowledge of whether that will happen. That's just, I guess, my hope that will happen. So I guess we'll find out. But I mean, I'm trying to do what I can. But
Yeah.
I mean, it's
I was just asking as
Yeah.
somebody that's in the industry of, I wouldn't exactly call it journalism, but just public outreach and public information about just kind of some of the trends that you had seen previously. I was just curious.
yeah. I mean, it's a really confusing time right now. It's in terms of what's happening with communications. So yeah.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Anyone have a final question they want to ask? Now's your chance. Yes.
This goes for both you and the Texas Tropical Network, but what opportunities do you have for students to get involved with things?
What opportunities are there for students to get involved in things? Eric, I imagine you can answer for the Tropical Network, but first of all, I'll kick it to Rhett, and I would add to that, you know, what opportunities are there at Mongabay or just in general? And I know that you all have your webinar like series that are kind of open to the public sometimes. So I'd invite you to share something about that and any other opportunities.
Yeah, so we have an opportunities list, where we share, you know, opportunities that arise. So that could be things like webinar training on a certain topic, to job opportunities, to our fellowship, to internships. So we don't have a lot of internships anymore, just because we don't really have the bandwidth. We aspire to do more. You can also potentially do stories for us and get paid for it. I mean, you know, anyone can be a journalist. So, you know, if you have the skill set. So, you know, it is a possibility. So I would encourage you to look at what those that opportunity section. So it's actually on mongabay.org. I mean, I think the link is also on .com at the top. But yeah, I mean, so there are opportunities. So I would just encourage you to sign up for the newsletter to get notified of what those are, and just also look at the website. Yeah, so I'll leave it at that.
I personally can attest to, there was one of those webinars that I think was focused on using like the rainforest satellite data. So Mongabay is making an effort to make some of those tools available to anyone. So that's really cool. And I also, before I give it back to you, Eric, I was wondering, like, on your question of just getting involved in all of the sort of things that we've been talking about around the environment, climate change, biodiversity, and ecology. Is there anyone in the audience who's part of any like organizations that can like raise your hand? Because it might be a good chance for people to just network. I see at least one person in the back. Like, let's all continue the conversation after if you're able to. But Eric, tell us about the Tropical Network.
Great. Well, I think I will also take this opportunity to wrap up tonight, unless there's any other questions that people really want to ask. I'm sure there'll be a few minutes afterwards to come up and ask questions. So as far as opportunities go, I'm really amazed by the amount of energy that the students at UT have. So the undergrad community here especially is amazing. Students always want opportunities to do research, to be involved in activism, and I think, you know, meeting that demand can be challenging. But there are a lot of groups on campus to put effort into, and that can really connect you with opportunities to, you know, put your energy towards something really amazing. The Office of Sustainability has a campus environmental center that does a lot of interesting work and events, and the Green Fund is part of that. That gave us our initial money. You can be a part of the Green Fund committee that actually reviews the applications that students put in to spend that Green Fund money, which comes out of student tuition on sustainability projects on campus. As far as our network, actually, you know, I only have the capacity to really run about one event per semester and maybe try to help co-sponsor something else. But if anyone wanted to become involved in helping with this, you know, maybe we can increase the number of events that we do every year. Thanks to the support of the Green Fund, we have money to pay an undergraduate research assistant who works at 10 hours a week, which is, you know, about the most that any undergrad can really devote to something outside of their studies. And I'm a full-time grad student, so that's probably what I have for this also. But you know, I think we could support a second person if someone is really passionate about this, wants to help organize events like this, coordinate with speakers, you know, coordinate to make informational and networking events happen. So there's a lot that you could do with us. If you're interested in that, you know, come talk to me after the event. And I think I will end it there. I really want to thank Rhett for his time and Keaton also for taking this on and leading such an interesting discussion. It was really amazing. So once again, if you're interested in getting on our listserv, please go to texastropicalnetwork.org and you can sign up there. Also, we have stickers with our logo on them. So if you would like a sticker, please come up and grab one after the event. Thank you all so much for coming.